Dear friends and colleagues from all over Europe, a warm welcome from the European offices here in Brussels to this digital event we're organizing in the context of our Women of Europe Awards series. The awards are designed to celebrate the role that women play in building a stronger, more integrated Europe and improving our society. And in the context of these awards, we often hold side events to discuss issues that affect, in particular, our efforts to achieve an equal and gender-based society. For that reason, we have been discussing with various of you what are the main challenges that women face in today's society. And it's clear that the emergence of anti-gender movements across the world and their proliferation, especially here in Europe, is posing a great threat to all the achievements, all the progress we have reached over the last few decades in an effort to make our societies more equal. So we wanted to gather together some experts, stakeholders, and policymakers to discuss exactly what is the threat that these anti-gender movements are posing and how can we defend the rights of women, both in the real world, but also online. So with me, I have a distinguished panel of experts and speakers that will be discussing with us these issues, starting with ASHA Allen, who is the Advocacy Director at the Center for Democracy and Technology. ASHA, thank you very much for joining us today. Also, Kim van SPARRENTAK, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Netherlands, is from the European Green Party. Kim, thanks a lot. Good to see you again with us. Also, IRENE DONADIO, who is a senior lead at IPPF European Network. And last but not least, MACWILLIAMS, who is a public opinion strategist with the Communication Hub, but also a long-standing partner of the European movement in a variety of ways. Thank you all again for taking time from your busy afternoons to join us today. And as I said at the introduction, we have seen the proliferation of anti-gender movements across the world, both in the US and Europe, but in other parts of the globe. And especially here in Europe, we see the manifestation both at the national, but also at the EU level. So perhaps I wanted to start with you, maybe, Kim, if I may, because we have seen that these movements are very much coordinated. They have close links across borders, and they're also very much present in the political debate, both in the European Parliament and national parliaments, but also the digital domain. So what are you policymakers are doing in the European Parliament to deal a little bit with that new movement of anti-gender actors?
Yeah, thank you very much. And also thank you for organizing this very timely discussion. It is indeed a topic that I think is very worrying for not only women or people who have a non-conforming gender, but it should be a worry for everyone. Because there is a movement that came up that is just trying to erase all the efforts that have been done to reach equality between different genders in the past what will it be, century, I guess. And this is very worrying, not only because of course equality is something we are striving towards as a union, as politicians, but also because it means that some rights are actively being taken away. And well, the first thing, of course, that we can do as politicians is ensuring we stand up against this. And I think the most, clear example we are having happening right now is that we see the anti-gender movement has extended so much that is taking away basic healthcare rights, such as the right to abortion, from people who need them. And we see that the counter reaction of many politicians, and also from a group of politicians in the European Parliament, has been to call for making sure that it's part of, the European Declaration of Human Rights. In France, there has been a discussion on ensuring that it will be part of the Constitution, the right to have an abortion. Same in the Netherlands, there's now also discussions on making sure it's not longer in the criminalization corner of the law, but will just be a right. And I think, having that first step of ensuring, that we protect these rights better, that's really important. On top of that, of course, we also have to see the bigger picture, and that is on the one hand seeing, where does this anti-gender movement come from? Whereas we used to see it very clearly, it came from certain conservative groups, from church groups, for example, for ultra-conservative church groups, for example, this anti-gender movement, this anti-equality movement, as you could actually call it. And nowadays we see that it's a way broader group, also that it's international. It's not just from one area, but we see, the same narratives in the United States, in Russia, in the European Union. So that is something that's very worrying. And indeed, the dissemination of the anti-gender narrative on the internet. And I think one thing is super clear, and something that I am working a lot on as a member of the European Parliament, is that we have to make sure that we stop this extreme dissemination of this extremely harmful, hateful, and polarizing content on the internet. Everyone has the freedom to say that they don't like something. But the problem is now that we have algorithms on social media that are actively amplifying these stories, that are actively amplifying hate against women, and anti-gender rhetorics. And the reason that those messages get on top of your timeline is because platforms want to make money. And when you see something outrageous, you stay longer on the platform, you get angry and you want to comment, or someone gets super excited that they read something they agree with, and then they comment or click on something. And that's how these platforms make the most money. So that is really one of the things that we are trying to put higher on the agenda of the European Commission, that, like the Digital Services Act doesn't tackle that problem. We really need to take a step further and see if we can ban these algorithms that are transferring these and disseminating and amplifying these kind of stories. And I think it's very important that we realize that this whole anti-gender discussion doesn't only come just from nowhere. It's not some people that just hate equality or hate women or hate transgender people. It's really also a very targeted part that it seems to be clearly part also of the Russian hybrid attacks on the Western world and on our European values of equality. For example, one of the things that is very clearly pushed in the Russian anti-democratic narratives and disinformation is the fear of strong, powerful women, such as Ursula von der Leyen, who are sort of like the evil versus the good Russia. So I think, having that whole package together of, some state actors that are trying to, delete equality and create anti-democratic movements in Europe, combined with a conservative group of people that has been very susceptible for this in the United States, but also elsewhere in Europe. And then on top of that, having big tech not being completely regulated on this aspect and just amplifying that story, that's what we have to tackle now. And that's one of the things that I'm working now on in the European Parliament.
Thank you, Kim. That's actually really a good way to set the scene and start a discussion, because obviously the challenge we face is multifaceted, and it really demonstrates the unfortunate environment we find ourselves in that enables the proliferation of this kind of movements. Irene, if I come to you quickly on the same question, but from the perspective of IPPF, because obviously those movements, those politicians, those political parties have really honed in their campaigns on the issue around abortion and overall reproductive rights. As Kim mentioned, there is a concerted effort to take control over women's body. And in some ways, this is just the peak of the iceberg in a sinister attempt to really impose a new type of patriarchy. So how can NGOs and civil society also work together with policymakers to fight back and push back on this effort from the side of these anti-gender movements?
I think there is a lot of space to work together, and there have been also very positive examples, particularly at European level. If you look at, for example, the situation in Poland, we all seen the erosion of democracy and human rights that Kim was referring to, the disinformation and the assaults to women's rights, and in particular to reproductive rights and LGBTI rights. At the same time, we know there is a consensus in Europe around a certain type of social model, around a certain type of democracy. And we saw a very strong support for the condemnation of Poland, not only in relation to abortion and the abortion ban, but also in relation to the attempts, for example, to criminalize the sharing of information on sexual and reproductive health rights or sexuality education, and of course all the LGBTI free zones. And what we also saw is that policymakers have started seeing the crucial linkage between the erosion of democracy and the erosion of the rule of law and the impact on people. And clearly, women are the ones on the front line. They are suffering. We've seen women dying in Poland, and we've seen a ban that has been established using the judiciary route, exactly like it has been done in the US. So we skipped parliamentary democracy, we skipped public scrutiny, and politicized bodies have imposed it on people. At the same time, what is also interesting was to see the incredible social reactions, in terms of intergenerational solidarity, in terms of people really flowing in the streets protesting. And at the same time, we also see that there was a huge international solidarity. Poland has been now scrutinized under the UPR, the respect of human rights, and Poland received 400 recommendations, and 70 of them are just on abortion. But I want to also underline that this is really part of a bigger political game, as Kim was stressing, because the issue is not only women's rights, sexual rights, LGBTI rights. These are scapegoats for something bigger, for the grabbing of power, for trying to get influence, enter a very important political club. We see this through, for example, the alliances around the Geneva Consensus, which is a former Trump administration initiative, a diplomatic initiative, to force the traditional families onto people and to curtail their rights. And I also want to underline once again that I'm sorry, it's not just for women that this is toxic and is dangerous. It's as dangerous for men in society. We see also that the agenda is not only controlling people's bodies and possibility to have a family. They're also fighting divorcing, fighting child custody, assisted reproduction. It's a very wide agenda that they want to impose on people, and they want to impose this model of traditional family that's in an imaginary family that nobody in Europe would like to live in. It's a suffocating space. So what we can do together certainly is make sure that people understand that this is a really big new political landscape, that we need to work together, all democratic forces alike, no matter what the political affiliation is, and that it is crucial to protect our democracy in general. We saw it with the attack to Capitol Hill in the US. We see it with what is going on in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, and the price we are paying as Europeans. And I think it's just a must that we all have to share to try to join forces.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly the right tone to set, because there is indeed a concerted effort, and which is one of the reasons why we are tackling this question, because it really is part of an overall campaign that it manifests itself in many ways. ASHA, we already heard that a lot of this also takes place online. The role that big tech and social media platforms playing in enabling the spread of this kind of narratives, but also their ability to organize, fundraise, and of course assault those that might hold different views to them, really happens a lot online. In a way, in fact, that is kind of pushing women, but also all those of us who are fighting this kind of regressive movement outside of those spaces. How do you see this battle as it manifesting itself online? And again, what is that we can do to perhaps counterbalance some of what we see online?
You're absolutely right. And thank you so much for allowing me to join the conversation today. And I really wanted to pick up on the point that was made, that we're talking about an anti-equality movement, but also an anti-equity movement. This really is a pushback against our advancements that we made in trying to bring down patriarchal structures that impact on all of us negatively. And so this is the pushback we're seeing. And we've been seeing this quite a lot since 2017, when we saw the coordinated and large movements against the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention to end violence against women and domestic violence. But coming to your question on the online dimension, there has been a lot of work that's been done over the last few years. And I would really like to highlight the really important research, which is fundamental to our understanding of the prevalence of the abuses that we see online. Incredible research from Amnesty International, for example, Glitch UK, Sheep Assisted, Plan International, the European Institute of Gender Equality, for example, have laid quite a solid foundation for us to be able to build our understanding on. And us here at CDT, we've actually published 2 research papers on the issue of gender disinformation against women and gender non-conforming folks, which has a specific dimension that touches on our ability to engage in civic discourse and really trying to silence and chill the free speech of politically engaged women and others. And our latest research actually looked at it from a very intersectional perspective, looking at the experience of women of color politicians in the US and how they are disproportionately experiencing online gender-based violence in comparison to their white colleagues. So, I mean, at EU level, we do see regulation like the Digital Services Act that has been mentioned. And it's really important to see that it does want to address issues of systemic risks like gender-based violence and potential discrimination, though, of course, the effectiveness will have to be seen in how it's implemented. But then we also have the long-awaited directive from the Commission to end gender-based violence. And we are encouraged to see that the online dimension is actually within scope of this. But again, the specificities of those will need to be explored later on. But I really want to drive the message home that the online dimension is so important, because as civic space actors, it is a vital resource, especially when we are living in a shrinking civic space. For activists to organize, to connect with their relevant communities, for raising awareness on fundamental rights issues, and for avenues of protection for activists and journalists who really need to rely on these spaces and the privacy it provides to do their outreach and to do their work. But the abuse and the online gender-based violence and the experiences that people are having, we see it's impacting on people's ability to benefit from their given international human rights to participate and to freely express themselves. So when we're thinking about how to tackle this in a concrete way, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Online gender-based violence is part of the continuum of violence against women, and it exists on a spectrum. And this is just one example of some of the issues that we're talking about today. But of course, the different abuses that marginalized groups face, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And so we need to be multi-pronged and multifaceted in how we move forward in this. Of course, we need proportionate legislative frameworks, but we also need effective due diligence obligations which increase transparency and increase accountability, which is so important. But we also need the continuous engagement of civil society who can provide independent analysis in these best approaches. So, for example, the Istanbul Convention has the group of experts, and they recently published very concrete recommendations on how member states can address the digital dimension of gender-based violence. And the DSA, with its two-pronged approach, does include some obligations. And I would like to zoom in on the risk assessment provisions in particular, because I think these will be key to addressing some of the issues that we're talking about here. And what I would like to reiterate is that these assessments will need to be conducted and evaluated using an intersectional methodology. So gender disinformation, for example, something that CDT has analyzed quite in depth, it touches on the risk of gender-based violence, but also risk to civic discourse, also risk to democratic participation and anti-discrimination. So you will need that relevant intersectional expertise in order to understand how these experiences actually intersect between the different forms of discrimination that many people may face, and for civil society to be able to inform those processes. So what we need are those clear legal certainties in our legal frameworks. We need very concrete and effective due diligence obligations, but we need to be informed by civil society who are on the ground and connecting with the communities who are impacted by this by the most.
That's really hits the nail on the head. And thank you very much, ASHA. That was very useful indeed. And Matt, if I can come to you, because already you can see the discussion and the scale of the challenge. But I think the one thing that comes across really strongly is that the interconnection between far-right, authoritarian, or populist, if some people want to call them, movements, and this anti-gender, anti-equality movement that we see emerging. And often in your research, we have seen the correlation between the worldviews held by those that ultimately might belong in both groups. How do you see that relationship? And is it indeed correct what we heard, that there is a broader agenda here? It's not just about equality, but it's a broader agenda from the regressive, authoritarian, far-right movements that we see popping up left and right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Petros, and thanks to everyone. It's been wonderful to hear your comments. And this is about building power. It's all about power. And is there a connection across these groups? Absolutely. And that connection really is sort of the 3 A's, I would say. It's attitudinally. They're hostile sexists. They've always been with us. They're now getting connected online, as ASHA pointed out. And that online connection is really important. But it's not just hostile sexists that are getting connected. There's this activation that's going on that is driving them. And the activation is an online activation. So who are getting connected? How is this getting built? It's base authoritarians who we can identify. It's hostile sexists. It's inconsistent supporters of democracies. It's homophobes, EU skeptics, anti-immigrant critics, and national identity firsters. And these are disparate audiences. There is some attitudinal overlap, but they're getting connected in the online world. And they're building, they're getting connected through a culture war, grievance culture. And we've seen the outcomes of that, and they're not good. So you have to look at these hostile sexist leaders, intersectionality, that's what this is all about. They're working across a range of issues to build power, and they're using 2 other techniques that are really important to recognize. First, they're connecting across these different groups of people, but they're also using wedge issues, concerns, and fears to expand their base. How? Look at the Czech Republic. 17% of the people from the polling we've done with EMI and ComSub are hostile sexists in Czech Republic. You're never going to get them. But another 18%, almost twice that number, so 35, agree with this statement: the women's movement increases the war between men and women and seeks to criminalize men. So you want to grow your base online, you talk about that to persuadable audiences, and you grow your base. And the other way that they build their movement, outside of connecting across all these different groups we just talked about, is our framing, our messaging. Too often our framing and our messaging, our responses to their culture war messaging, their grievance culture, their fear messaging, feeds the fire of anti-gender movements they're trying to build. And we have to be very careful that when we communicate, we do no harm. But quite often we do harm. So we have to be very, very careful about how we respond. And I think instead of playing in the fear-based, grievance-based frame, we need to move to a hope-based frame and a freedom frame. Democracy is incredibly important, but what drives support for democracy is support for freedom. And everything these groups are talking about are taking away freedoms for people. So, this is about power. Make no mistake about it. It is, as everyone has said, it is global in its work or opposition to what we care about. And it's something that is, we have to be very, very careful, but very, very strong in our response to it.
That's great. And I'm glad you mentioned this in the framing and how we change the narrative around those issues, because we noticed that after the 2019 European election, there was a considerable increase in members of the European Parliament that fit some of those attitudinal attributes, the authoritarians, the anti-equality politicians, anti-LGBT, generally the unsavory characters that you were describing earlier. So perhaps my next question will be, and maybe I'll come first to you, Kim, what can we do to make sure that this surge that we witnessed in 2019. And by our calculation, we saw an increase of 30% almost of this kind of members of the European Parliament. And there are some worse numbers when you look at some national legislatures across Europe and the US, of course. So what can we do to ensure that this surge is stopped and reversed? And keeping in mind, some of the ideas and tips that Matt was also mentioning when it comes to our communications.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very good question. Although, I mean, yes, it's worrying that we had an increase, but I also have to say that, they're not winning yet. We still have clear majorities when we are voting about women's rights, when we're voting on abortion rights in the European Parliament. And also as co-president of the LGBTI intergroup, I can say that, we have more than 170 members of the European Parliament that are a member of our intergroup. And also we see that also when it comes to these rights, we have majorities. And we even, adopted the declaration, for example, to have an LGBTI freedom zone in the European Union. So in that sense, it's not as bleak, but I totally agree. We have to make sure that these numbers don't increase, because that is, of course, a danger that we are seeing. And we're seeing also that on a national level, these, the groups, the political parties that represent these anti-gender groups are growing, that they get more power, and especially because they are supported by other political parties that are more actually center or center-right, such as EPP, such as the Liberals, that are now supporting these groups to get into a position of power. So I think, first of all, that is something we have to have more strategic discussions about across the political spectrum. To what extent is it acceptable that we do that? To what extent should we also say, okay, as soon as you start to, push minorities to the side and are polarizing our society, we don't work with you. We already have a cordon sanitaire in the European Parliament, but maybe we should have a bit of a broader discussion on that. Also because we see that this cordon sanitaire is sometimes getting a bit slippery and it's not always lived up to. Then I think what is extra crucial is that we make this a debate. That's why I'm also so happy we're discussing it here today, because it has to be one of the core topics when we are going to the next European elections. What kind of Europe do we want? Do we want a Europe where we strive towards equality on every level? Do we want a Europe where women are respected in the same way as men, where transgender people, people of color can live their lives without being feared of being a victim to a hate crime, either online or offline? I think that is really a core discussion we have to have towards the European election. And as a Green, of course, what I saw happening before the European elections last time, where we really saw a big push from climate activists going on the streets, everyone saying this is the climate election. I really hope that we can broaden it now, and also looking at, for example, the situation of the war in Ukraine. We're not only talking about energy independence and making sure we get de-linked from authoritarian regimes when it comes to energy and the climate, but also when it comes to their narratives, and that we continue fighting for our European democratic values.
Indeed, and I think that's at the heart of the challenge, because, like it was mentioned earlier, there is a concerted effort to attack our values, both our democracy, but also our freedoms and our rights, and that involves everything we have discussed so far. And I think it's important that we build that counter movement ahead of the next European elections, because the challenge is immense. ASHA, we've seen that, again, perhaps drawing from what Matt said, and also what you were saying earlier, we've seen those movements really take hold of the online space. With the next European elections in mind, we have about a year and a half ahead of us. How can we organize, how can we put forward this counter movement? We've been working together with various stakeholders. Matt is very much embedded in that work, to really flood the online space with this positive counter narratives around the values we represent and, of course, the European Union and European integration itself. So how can we pull together various actors to make sure that when it comes to the European elections, our fellow citizens are not just poisoned by the kind of things we see now, but they get the other side of the argument too?
Yes, absolutely. And the European elections will come around a lot faster than we imagine, of course, with them only being 18 months away. And there's a lot of things to consider here. And I think one of the aspects that this civil society in particular, but those of our allies in the European Parliament and others have been discussing, is not developing campaigns or movements necessarily that is about just focusing on the countering. And that is to really drive home the positivity and the joy in the collective work that we are doing, trying to advance equality and equity for all of us, and really being able to connect that to the citizens and to the people that we are engaging with everybody who is in our environment, but of course those in marginalized groups and to be specific. I think there's an aspect of this that we must be clear about. We must work collaboratively and concretely as civil society organizations and decision makers to raise awareness on the societal benefits of achieving gender equality and the progress that it means for all of us. As going back to IRENE's point, patriarchy is damaging and negative to us all. So just driving home that point there on how it benefits us all. Our continued strive for gender, racial equity, climate justice has led to advancements, but we still have a long way to go. And I think we need to be realistic in how far we still need to go, but we need to be driven by positivity and our drive to reach those achievements, which are not unattainable. And there are three concrete words that always come to mind when I think of this, and that is the collaboration in our cause. We are all driving for the same thing of equality and equity. It's the consistency in our method. And that means making sure that we as civic actors, as decision makers, are also doing that internal reflective. Are we truly adopting a gender sensitive approach into what we're doing? Are we truly being intersectional and inclusive in the methods that we are adopting? And are we assessing the work that we are doing and making sure that it's engaging with the different communities out there? And lastly, the last word is accountability. Accountability to those who we are striving for the change, who we are striving with and working with, and what we are striving towards.
Irene, from your perspective and the work of IPPF, I think the effort of dealing with policymakers, but also fighting in the context of ahead of elections, in the context of the electoral battle, is very, very important, especially when it comes to some of the issues you are working with. How are you preparing for the next European elections? What do you think are the priorities and your main instruments in combating this?
There's been a very big reality check because of what has happened lately that you all have seen, and I think it's this important alert that has to open the eyes of everybody. But I want also to go back to what ASHA and Matt were saying. What we consider a priority is to do a hope-based communication, because people are tired to be told not to vote for that one because it's evil, because it's manipulative, because it's this and that, while they don't have a real option. So I think that the first thing that we all need is to pay due respect, listen to people's concerns, but also provide them with a vision that is really, really positive and is relevant to the reality they're living in. The second, I think if you want to take genders, it's clear that people are very worried about climate change, about the future. But I think people should also be worried for their kids about the type of society they will be living in if they don't take action. And I think also that we should communicate the possibility to shape this future, to be able to have a real impact in this future. And of course, when it comes to sexual and reproductive rights, there are a lot of positive things happening, and there are a lot of good things that governments from both sides of the political spectrum, meaning right and left, have done. If you take abortion, for example, abortion was legalized in Ireland with a conservative government, and equality marriage also came with a conservative government. We see in Poland that Donald Tusk, a conservative politician, the leader of a conservative party, is saying if we will win the elections, we will legalize abortion. So there is a difference. It's something of reclaiming our patrimony, of reclaiming our values and fighting for them, but also in a positive manner so that people feel they are empowered and they can believe in Europe and they can believe in a better future for their own kids. And this can be also done using, for example, strategic communication. As Matthew was saying, we are investing a lot in looking at the frames, looking at the common ground to overcome polarization, for example, and ensuring that we can speak to all the type of audiences, not only the obvious ones, not only the like-minded, but we as human beings become able to discuss with each other and to agree on what is crucial. And I think all of these elements are very important within a democratic framework, because what we saw is not only digital violence, we saw real violence, we saw police violence, neo-Nazi violence. And I think there is an important awareness and response that needs to be coming from governments and from society to protect human rights defenders on the front line, to protect freedom defenders on the front line, because they're getting so many slaps. And just to define a new system of protection, a new system for freedom in Europe, I think is a crucial element, and something that possibly in the European elections will be at stake.
Indeed. And, we cannot start soon enough, because perhaps turning our attention to the US a little bit, we've seen what the results can be when people like Donald Trump take over the White House, and when the Supreme Court is in fact hijacked and reverses law and legislation. And Matt, maybe I'll come to you, because you have obviously an eye on Europe too, and you've been working with us here as well as on the other side of the Atlantic. And do you see parallels? And are there any cautionary tales for us to draw from recent events in the US where women's rights have been undermined and attacked openly from a variety of sources, especially from the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, this is the right-wing authoritarian playbook that we've seen played out in the United States, and it really started in 1978 election, which I was involved with, and still am involved. So the parallels are there, and the cautionary tale is take it seriously. And I think we all are here. And then the other cautionary tale is really something that ASHA and IRENE and Kim all mentioned. We can't fight on their turf, which means we need positive communications. We can't be fighting in the polarized universe, because that's what they want. They want disunity. I noticed Petros, the European movement logo, it says democracy, unity, solidarity. We have to be thinking about unity and solidarity. So we need hope-based communications. We have to give people a reason to turn out. We need to focus on churning out our base. That's what we just saw in this last election in the United States. The base, Democratic base, the base that cares about the future turned out. And today it's turning out in Georgia too in a way that is unprecedented. We have to churn out our base, but we also, with the hope-based communications, need to go to those persuadables and talk to them in a way that works. And the key is to do no harm with them, because the wrong messaging can drive them either to not participate or to drive them to the other side. And we've seen this in lots of research. So we have to be very intentional about how we communicate and realize that some of the ways that we talk and some of the things that we believe, those of us on this panel today, don't work with persuadable voters. And so what works? What will move them? And I think it really comes back to discussions of freedom in the end. And that's, democracy is on the ballot. That's what Biden and Obama talked about. They were wrong. It was freedom was on the ballot in the United States in this last election. And candidates who talked about freedom did very, very well. So I think we need research on this. We need then to have really disciplined communications, and the communications need to be targeted to base audience and to persuadable segments to drive the vote for us. And that's a key lesson. I think. And also within all that hope-based communications, it's so easy just to lash out when an authoritarian or a hostile sexist says something that is wrong and stupid. But we can't. We have to do it strategically if we are going to attack back, and to make sure that it benefits what we're trying to do, which is build a better future.
Indeed. And again, I think if I come back to what Kim was saying, we see considerable efforts within the European Parliament to ensure that this ideology doesn't take hold. But at the national level, the challenge is even worse. And already Poland has been used as an example, but also Hungary. Recently, we've seen changes in Italy where ministers responsible for these issues are holding views that are, of course, go against women's rights. And we go further afield, even in Sweden, but also in Spain, where that cordon sanitaire might be broken if the conservatives decide to partner with far-right parties who have this kind of ideology. Do you think that we might find ourselves in a European Union, especially one that is, for better or worse, governed by the European Council, where we will have a significant blocking minority that might make it very difficult for us to defend the values, the freedoms, and the rights that the EU is supposed to defend?
Well, I hope not, but it is indeed a tendency we are seeing, right? I would like to be overly optimistic on this, but I can't be. The reality is, we see that these political movements are growing, and that they are managing to get some political foothold in several countries, and it's worrying. And that's why I also think, it's really, really important that when we look at several legislations, that we are strategic, that we look at, okay, this is good as it is right now. Maybe this is not the moment to reopen it and improve it because, there might be a backlash against it. But also to really look at, the democratic situation in Europe. And of course, there's a lot of talks about, do we want to reopen the treaties? Do we want to see if we can get rid of the unanimity in the council, which, for when it comes to talking about gender issues, would be actually something positive, because right now we just need one member state to block things on when it comes to gender, and that is something we're seeing happening all the time. And there are coordinated efforts between several member states to make sure that everything that is written about gender or LGBTI rights, that it goes down and down and down. And then every time, the watered down text on LGBTI rights or gender equality are then the new standard and the new threshold. So we have to make sure, first of all, that we look at making sure that they don't get too much power because of the way that the European Union is built. But also we have to really see to ensure that indeed this cordon sanitaire isn't broken, and that the member states that have democratic parties in their government really push against this as well in the council. When it comes to the European Parliament, I think we have to also continue discussing with member states and the Commission to see how we go forward on this issue, and really see how we can also put an end to the backsliding of rights. We have, of course, a very it's very positive that the European Commission now has a commissioner for equality, someone who really is trying to ensure that equality stays high on the agenda. It's something I really hope will be continued also for the next commission, and by having collaboration of the democratic parties and the democratic groups in Europe, we managed to continue. But it's going to be difficult, and I think we will just have to make sure that we continue having these conversations, and really indeed also be able to explain what's on the line. It's not just where it always comes down to about gender neutral bathrooms and all those discussions that are being used as some sort of weird red flag to fearmonger about gender issues. But it's about making sure that minorities are still protected in our society, that democracy is protected, and that we continue the way towards an equality and an equal society.
Indeed. Irene and both ASHA, I think that's something that perhaps as a civil society organization ourselves, as one that is really advocating in favor of these values we'll be discussing, we've noticed that the opposite side is remarkably well financed. There are linkages from across the Atlantic. You see a lot of money flowing through from religious and far-right groups into the European context. And a lot of it is invested, of course, online for these campaigns. Is there something that you have also noticed as well in your work, that very well-financed operations that are now taking action in Europe? And what can we do to match that firepower as civil society organizations? Irene, maybe I can go first with you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for raising this. I wanted to come to this point because I think it's very important to see these funding streams and the impact that they have. So we saw it, even if you remember, at the time of the previous elections, when we saw a scandal in the Council of Europe that involved an Italian politician called Luca Volonté from the EPP party, who was piloting a vote on human rights for Azerbaijan and getting money from Azerbaijan for the traditional family, but also from groups close to the Kremlin. And that money was redistributed to these groups and political allies. Then we saw Trump and we saw Bannon, and we saw the attempts again to distribute resources to certain groups. So clearly this is not neutral. And on the other hand, the fact that we take so much for granted in the European Union means that the human rights defender, the civil society, they are defending civil space, they are defending an equal society for everybody, are totally left out in the chill. And that's really problematic, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And that's why I think it's part of this understanding of the importance of this battle. If you consider that in Kenya, we've been told by partners that before the violence around elections were fought around tribal divisions, and now they are on gender positioning. It tells you how gender has been weaponized to conquer power, what Matt was saying earlier on. So it is very important that all people in society, not just the people in the niche working on gender equality, working on women, working on LGBTI, but all the ones that are actually having power in society, realize that this is such a big game, and that requires a careful, strong investment, including a very strong financial investments, both on the communication side, to give options to people when they vote, but also to protect people who are working for the well-being of society and who are working to protecting the freedoms of all. So thank you for raising this. And I think that's another important thing, because if you look at the funding and you look, for example, who is or was campaigning against the sanctions against Russia, and then you will look at their political positioning on gender or the family issues and sexual and reproductive rights, you will find a very strange, suspicious overlap. Tell me who your friends are, and I'll tell you who you are. So let's hope that people really finally realize that.
Indeed. And I think that's crucial to remind. I think it links very much to what Kim was saying at the beginning, but also the links with the similar movements in the US. ASHA, again, you're working a lot on the online space and how to defend democracy there. And I think the question of funding and also the resources that go into campaigning online on these issues are frightening, in fact. What does your work, what does your research show?
Absolutely. I think I won't reiterate the points that IRENE brilliantly made there about the threat to the shrinking civic space. It cannot be taken for granted that civic space in Europe will always be there. I think if we look to think about how important civil society is as that third actor of democracy for accountability, independence, oversight, it is essential that there is a consistent effort to make sure civil society is well funded and well resourced. But I think there's also these aspects of looking into what the opportunities are now. For CDT, we are very focused on trying to make sure that we have as many protections and safeguards into the different, whether it's legislative or other opportunities that we have, to kind of bolster what we do have at this moment in time and to see how we can go further. And this allows me to kind of go back to some of the points that Kim was making, or some of the great work that's happening in the European Parliament. There are a lot of initiatives that we have happening right now, and we can make a lot of advancements in making sure they are secured, they have adequate and sufficient safeguards in there before we're looking at the next parliament, for example, on the directive on violence against women and domestic violence, on making sure the DSA is implemented with a human rights approach centered lens at its very core, on different mechanisms that are moving forward, whether it's the AI Act and thinking about the human rights considerations in there, or on political advertising, which is very much linked to this, and making sure we strike that balance in ensuring that we don't see another Cambridge Analytica situation, but at the same time making sure that we are protecting people's political speech and free expression, because as we know, any kind of encroachments on those will impact on those who are most marginalized the most and the hardest. So I think it's about, again, looking at it from this positive lens, but being very honest in ensuring that there is more resourcing coming our way as civil society, because we are a fundamental part of the democratic structure, and that cannot be understated. But that also means making sure that we have an equitable voice and participation as things are moving forward, because otherwise there won't be that oversight that's needed.
Indeed. And Matt, we've seen the strong role that civil society is playing in the US, working together with political leaders to perhaps combat the rise of anti-equality movements. But the same kind of, unfortunately, strength of civil society maybe isn't so much present in Europe. Or maybe we're not doing the right things. And a lot of the work that we have been collaborating on is to equip civil society with the tools to be able to run campaigns as effectively as the other side. Even if we're not as well financed, we can still be as effective. Again, what do you think? What are the lessons we can learn perhaps from some of the work that the gender movement, but also LGBTI movements have undertaken, all the victories they've had in the US, and apply them also here in Europe?
Well, I think, part of it goes to what Irene said. I thought the Kenya example was very, very apt. How did gender become weaponized? It didn't just happen. It was a plan, and it was a communications plan, a strategic plan that happened over time. Those conversations like that are going on right now in Europe, and they're setting the table for online conversations. They're setting the table for the next election cycle. And first, we got to be aware of those conversations. So that's listening. So listening to what's going on online. What are the narratives? What are the frames? And then second, we will never have the resources that the other side does. Why? Because they make money out of spewing their hate. I go back to what Kim said. We got to change the algorithm. The algorithm favors fear, and favoring fear means that fear makes money. So we got to change that algorithm, but we have to realize that we have something on our side the other side doesn't have. And that's, we really have public support. So we have to actualize that support. So we have to have the campaign infrastructure that listens to what's going on, understands what the narratives are, and then is able to reach our base and persuadables in a way that activates them to choose hope. And what I've seen, I've just come out of the field with a whole bunch of focus groups, is just the people are really tired of the polarization. They're tired of the chaos. They're tired of the confrontation. And there are two ways you can go on that. Number one, you can just say, I'm out of it. I'm not paying any more attention. I'm returning to my own space. Forget civic space. I'm just going to personal space. That's bad for us. That's what the other side wants. The other thing is that, no, I'm not going to allow that happen. I want to protect my freedom, XYZ, or the freedom of someone else. And we have to reach out, tap them. We have to have the resources to do it. We can't compete with the corporate, a lot of this, it's right-wing money, it's corporate money, it's a lot of different things. Can't compete with it. We don't need to. We just need to be strategically very, very smart about how we communicate and how we use the resources we do have. And we all can't be off on different programs. I go to the intersectionality here. We have to realize we're all in this together. And what's the best way to get to the endpoint that we want, which is a society that's equal and fair and values freedom.
Indeed. Perhaps, as unfortunately time is running out, maybe this is also a good way to conclude, but I'll just squeeze in one last question, and maybe Kim, I'll come to you for the final word, because like Matt said, by and large in Europe, in most European countries, public opinion on those issues still is on our side, even though authoritarian, far-right, regressive political forces are winning elections. I think they're doing it not because of shifts in public opinion, but despite it. So, how can we, again, with the 2024 elections in mind, make sure that the challenge here, like you said, is not just our environment, but our fundamental values, our freedoms and our rights, and the kind of society we will hand over to our kids. Perhaps since you have been the optimist in this discussion, maybe I'll come to you for the final word.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think, what we have to realize, indeed, we don't maybe have all the money, but we have a lot of groups of very, very engaged activists, in the LGBTI community, in the women's rights community, that are still pushing the boundaries and are fighting for equality. And I think, we have to see if there is a way we can put them on a pedestal as well towards the elections and really show that, in Europe, that's what we stand for. And I think when we can tap into, that power and enthusiasm and this willingness to fight for a better Europe, and also can show that is what the European Union really can stand for and can fight for, then we can really make sure that these far right, anti-democratic, anti-equality movements don't win, but that it's us that will win in the end.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, ASHA, and thank you, IRENE. This has been a really empowering conversation, very fruitful, and it's only the beginning, because we have a year and a half ahead of us. In a couple of days, we will be celebrating all the great women in power, in activism, in business, in youth that have been doing great work across Europe, but also, every day, every week, every month between now and the European elections, we will be coming to you because we need to build those partnerships, we need to build those alliances across civil society, across the political spectrum, across the Atlantic even, to make sure that those powers of regression don't take hold of our societies. Thank you again for taking part in today's conversation. We're looking forward to collaborating more. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Please stay tuned in, follow the European movement on social media and on our website, and we look forward to seeing you in our next discussion. Have a nice evening.